The final confrontation began as the smoke cleared, and Maria could see the enemy fighters regrouping at the eastern end of the ravine. They had used the concealment to organize a desperate assault, knowing that their only chance of survival was to overwhelm the ridge position before reinforcements arrived. Maria counted 4 fighters still capable of combat, their weapons trained on her position as they prepared to attack. Wilson and Jenkins had reached a supporting position 50 meters below Maria's ridge, giving them overlapping fields of fire that would create a deadly crossfire if the enemy fighters attempted to advance. But Maria knew that the success of their defense would ultimately depend on her ability to maintain accurate fire from the commanding position she had fought so hard to reach. "Rodriguez, we're in position to support you." Wilson's voice came through her radio. "You call the shots from up there. We'll follow your lead." The trust implicit in Wilson's words struck Maria powerfully. A veteran soldier with 3 combat deployments was deferring to her tactical judgment, recognizing that her aggressive positioning had given her the best understanding of the enemy's capabilities and intentions. She was no longer just a medic who could fight. She had become a combat leader. "I count 4 fighters preparing to assault from the east end," Maria reported, studying the enemy positions through her rifle scope. "They're going to try to rush our position in approximately 30 seconds. Wait for my signal, then concentrate fire on the lead elements." The mountain wind carried the sound of the enemy fighters' voices as they coordinated their final attack. Maria couldn't understand their language, but their tone and body language clearly indicated preparation for a desperate assault. They knew that ground reinforcements were approaching and that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The first enemy fighter emerged from the ravine at a full sprint, his automatic weapon firing wildly as he charged toward Maria's position. She tracked him through her scope, leading the target carefully before squeezing the trigger. Her shot was precise and devastating, dropping the fighter immediately and causing the others to hesitate in their assault. "Now, engage, engage!" Maria called over the radio as the remaining fighters committed to their attack, despite the loss of their lead element. Wilson and Jenkins opened fire from their supporting position, creating the crossfire that Maria had anticipated. The enemy fighters found themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire from 2 different angles, making it impossible for them to advance while maintaining any semblance of tactical formation. But the desperate fighters continued their assault with the fury of men who knew they were facing death regardless of their actions. One fighter managed to reach a position within grenade range of Maria's ridge, pulling the pin on a fragmentation grenade as bullets struck the rocks around him. Maria saw the grenade leave the fighter's hand and immediately threw herself behind the largest boulder she could find. The explosion shattered the mountain silence, sending rock fragments flying in all directions and temporarily stunning everyone within a 100-meter radius. When the smoke and debris settled, Maria found herself partially buried under loose stones but otherwise uninjured. The grenade explosion had also wounded the fighter who threw it, but he was still attempting to engage Maria's position with his rifle. She could see him moving among the rocks below her position, blood streaming down his face but his weapon still functional. Her medical training automatically assessed his injuries even as she prepared to engage him. "Rodriguez, report!" Wilson's voice carried clearly across the mountainside, tinged with concern after the grenade explosion. "Are you operational?" "Still here," Maria replied, brushing debris from her equipment and checking her rifle for damage. "One fighter remaining, approximately 20 meters below my position." The final enemy fighter was trapped in essentially the same situation that Maria had used to her advantage throughout the engagement. He was in an exposed position with limited cover, while she maintained the high ground with superior fields of fire. But his desperation made him extremely dangerous, as wounded fighters often fought with reckless abandon. Maria could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching from the south, indicating that ground reinforcements were finally arriving. But the remaining fighter could still cause significant casualties. If he managed to reach her position or escape to threaten other members of her squad. The fighter made his final assault up the slope toward Maria's position, his rifle firing on full automatic as he climbed over the rocky terrain. Maria waited until he was completely committed to his approach before engaging, knowing that she would only get one opportunity for a clean shot. Her final shot of the engagement was also her most important, ending the threat decisively and ensuring the safety of her squad. As the echo of her rifle faded across the mountain valleys, an unusual silence settled over the battlefield. The ambush that had begun with such violence and chaos was finally over. Alpha 2, this is Bravo 6. A new voice came through their radio as the reinforcement helicopters approached the landing zone. We have your position in sight. Are you ready to receive ground support? Wilson looked around at his 3 remaining squad members, amazed that they had all survived such a deadly engagement. Davis was uninjured but exhausted from the stress of combat. Jenkins had sustained minor wounds from rock fragments but remained fully functional. And Maria, the medic who had single-handedly disrupted the enemy's tactical plan, was climbing down from her ridge position with the confidence of a seasoned warrior. Bravo 6, this is Alpha 2, Wilson replied. Landing zone is secure. All Alpha personnel accounted for and ready for extraction. As the reinforcement helicopters landed and additional soldiers secured the area, Maria finally had a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. She had begun the day as a combat medic whose primary role was treating wounded soldiers. She was ending it as a proven warrior who had demonstrated that medical personnel could be every bit as effective in combat as traditional infantry soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the battalion commander, approached Maria as she prepared her after-action report. His expression reflected both surprise and admiration as he reviewed the tactical situation that her squad had faced and overcome. Sergeant Rodriguez, he said formally, I've been briefed on your actions during this engagement. Your decision to remain with your squad and lead the defense of that ridge position was far beyond the normal expectations for medical personnel. Maria looked at the colonel with the same steady confidence that had carried her through the firefight. Sir, I was trained to save lives. Sometimes that means providing medical treatment, and sometimes it means engaging the enemy. Both skills are part of being a complete soldier. The colonel nodded, understanding that he was looking at a new type of warrior, one who embodied the evolution of military medicine from a purely support role to an integral part of combat operations. Maria's actions would become a case study in military schools, demonstrating that the old distinctions between combat and support personnel were becoming increasingly irrelevant. As the helicopters lifted off with Alpha Squad aboard, Maria looked back at the mountain pass where she had proven that medics could indeed fight when the situation demanded it. The landscape below showed the scars of their engagement, but it also represented a victory that had been achieved through courage, skill, and the willingness to challenge conventional expectations. Wilson, sitting across from Maria in the helicopter, finally spoke the words that everyone was thinking. Rodriguez, I don't ever want to hear anyone say that medics don't fight, not after what you did out there today. Maria smiled, knowing that her actions had forever changed how her fellow soldiers viewed combat medics. She had entered the battle as someone whose job was to save lives after the fighting was over. She had emerged as a warrior who understood that sometimes the best way to save lives was to engage the enemy with the same intensity and skill as any infantry soldier. The helicopter carried them back to base, where Maria would write her report and continue her duties as a combat medic. But she would never again be seen as just a medical specialist who happened to carry a rifle. She had proven herself to be a complete soldier, equally capable of healing wounds and inflicting decisive tactical defeats on enemy forces. Maria's movement to the ridge overlooking the ravine was the most dangerous decision she had ever made. As she left the relative safety of the rocky outcropping, enemy fire immediately focused on her position. Bullets whined past her head as she zigzagged across the exposed terrain, using every available piece of cover to mask her advance. Her squad provided covering fire, but they were limited in their ability to suppress all the enemy positions simultaneously. Wilson watched through his rifle scope as Maria bounded from rock to rock, each movement bringing her closer to the ridge but also deeper into danger. She's got guts. I'll give her that, Davis muttered as he fired at an enemy position that was trying to track Maria's movement. But this is insane, even for a medic. The ridge position offered exactly what Maria had hoped for, a commanding view of the ravine where the enemy fighters were attempting their flanking maneuver. She could see all 6 fighters moving in single file through the narrow passage, their weapons ready, but their attention focused on reaching the far end where they planned to attack her squad. Maria took a moment to control her breathing and steady her rifle, knowing that she would only get one opportunity to disrupt the enemy's attack. Her medical training had taught her the importance of precision under pressure, skills that translated perfectly to combat marksmanship. Each shot would need to count. The first enemy fighter was only 30 meters away when Maria opened fire. Her rifle cracked sharply in the mountain air, and the fighter immediately dropped to the ground. The other 5 fighters scrambled for cover within the confines of the ravine, suddenly realizing that their concealed approach had been detected and countered. "Contact! We're taking fire from the ridge!" one of the enemy fighters shouted in his native language, though Maria couldn't understand the words. But their body language and movement patterns told her everything she needed to know about their tactical situation. From her elevated position, Maria had a significant advantage over the trapped fighters. They were confined to a narrow space with limited cover, while she could engage them from multiple angles as they tried to find protection. Her medical knowledge of human anatomy guided her shot placement, ensuring maximum effectiveness with each round fired. The enemy fighters tried to return fire, but their weapons were designed for close-range combat, rather than precision shooting at an elevated target. Most of their bullets struck the rocks below Maria's position, sending sparks and stone fragments flying but failing to find their mark. Wilson's voice crackled through Maria's radio earpiece. "Rodriguez, outstanding work. You've got them pinned down. Can you hold that position?" "Affirmative," Maria replied, continuing to engage targets as they tried to move within the ravine. "But I'm getting low on ammunition. How long until reinforcements arrive?" "Base says 20 minutes for ground support," Jenkins reported from their position. "Guardian Angel is running low on fuel and will have to return to base soon." 20 minutes felt like a lifetime when facing 6 enemy fighters with limited ammunition. Maria calculated that she had perhaps 60 rounds remaining, which meant every shot had to count. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition on suppressive fire. Each round needed to eliminate a specific threat. The enemy fighters began coordinating their movements, trying to advance through the ravine while some of their number provided covering fire. Maria could see them communicating with hand signals, indicating a level of training and coordination that made them more dangerous than typical insurgent forces. One fighter attempted to climb out of the ravine, using a steep section of the wall, hoping to reach a position where he could engage Maria directly. She tracked his movement through her rifle scope, waiting for the perfect moment when he would be most exposed and vulnerable. The shot was perfect, sending the fighter tumbling back into the ravine and demonstrating to the others that escape from their trapped position would be nearly impossible. Maria's precision shooting was keeping all 6 fighters pinned down in an area roughly the size of a basketball court. But the enemy fighters were also learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics to counter Maria's advantages. They began using smoke grenades to obscure her vision, making it much more difficult to identify and engage specific targets within the ravine. "Smoke in the ravine," Maria reported to her squad. "I'm losing visual on the targets." The thick gray smoke began billowing up from the ravine, carried by mountain winds that made it impossible to predict where it would drift. Maria could hear movement within the smoke but couldn't identify specific targets for engagement. The enemy fighters were using the concealment to reorganize and potentially escape from their trapped position. Wilson made a tactical decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "All stations, this is Alpha 2 Actual. We're moving to support Rodriguez's position. Davis, you maintain overwatch from here." "Sir, that's going to leave us scattered across 3 positions," Jenkins protested as he prepared to move. "If they break out of that ravine, we won't be able to concentrate our firepower. Rodriguez has them pinned down, but she needs support," Wilson replied. "We can't leave her up there alone when they start using that smoke to maneuver." Maria watched as Wilson and Jenkins began moving toward her position, exposing themselves to enemy fire in order to provide her with backup. Their decision to support her rather than maintain their defensive positions was a clear indication that they now saw her as a full member of their combat team, not just a medic who happened to carry a rifle. The enemy fighters seemed to sense the change in tactical dynamics as additional soldiers began moving toward the ridge position. Through the smoke, Maria could hear shouted commands and increased movement as they tried to escape from the ravine before being completely surrounded. "I can hear them moving toward the east end of the ravine," Maria reported. "If they reach that position, they'll have clear fields of fire on both our positions." The Apache helicopter pilot's voice came through their radio. "Alpha 2, this is Guardian Angel. We're at bingo fuel and need to return to base. Ground support is still 15 minutes out. Can you hold until then? Wilson looked at their tactical situation with the experienced eye of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. They were spread across multiple positions, facing an unknown number of enemy fighters with limited ammunition and no immediate air support. By conventional military standards, their situation was extremely dangerous. But Maria had already proven that conventional standards didn't apply to their current situation. Her decision to stay and fight rather than evacuate with the wounded had disrupted the enemy's plans and given her squad a fighting chance. Now it was time to finish what she had started. Guardian Angel Alpha 2 copies. We'll hold until ground support arrives, Wilson replied, his voice carrying a confidence that reflected his trust in Maria's tactical abilities. As the Apache helicopter departed and the smoke began to clear from the ravine, Maria could see that the enemy fighters had used the concealment to consolidate their position. They were now grouped together at the eastern end of the ravine, preparing for a coordinated assault on the ridge position. The final phase of the engagement was about to begin, and Maria knew that everything would depend on her ability to continue fighting like the warrior she had proven herself to be. With the medical helicopter gone, Maria found herself in a completely different situation than she had ever trained for. The 4 remaining members of Alpha Squad were now surrounded by enemy fighters in mountainous terrain, with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of rescue. Her role had suddenly evolved from medic to full combat soldier. "Rodriguez, what the hell are you doing?" Wilson called as he saw her taking up a fighting position with her rifle. "You should have left with the wounded." "My squad isn't complete yet," Maria replied, checking her ammunition and surveying the enemy positions around them. "We all go home together or we don't go home at all." Davis looked at her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The young soldier had never seen a medic voluntarily stay behind in a combat situation, especially when she had a legitimate opportunity to evacuate with the casualties. But Maria's decision reflected a warrior ethos that went beyond traditional military roles. The Apache helicopter continued to provide close air support, systematically destroying enemy positions as the crew identified targets. But the mountainous terrain provided numerous hiding places, and enemy fighters continued to appear from unexpected locations. Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions, indicating that they were still significantly outnumbered. "Alpha 2, this is Guardian Angel," the Apache pilot's voice came through Jenkins's radio. "We're showing movement in multiple locations around your position. Recommend you find better cover and prepare for a sustained engagement." Wilson studied their tactical situation with the experienced eye of a veteran soldier. They were positioned in relatively open ground near the destroyed vehicles, making them vulnerable to fire from the surrounding high ground. But moving to a more defensible position would require crossing exposed terrain while under enemy observation. "There's a rocky outcropping about 100 meters to our east," he announced, pointing toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide better protection. "If we can reach that position, we can establish a stronger defensive perimeter." Maria looked at the route Wilson had identified, mentally calculating the time it would take to cross the open ground and the likelihood of casualties during the movement. Her medical training had taught her to assess risk versus benefit in life-threatening situations, and this movement represented a calculated gamble. "I'll provide covering fire while you 3 move first," she offered, already positioning herself to engage the enemy positions. "Once you're in position, you can cover my movement." "Negative," Wilson replied firmly. "You're too valuable to risk like that. We move together or not at all." But Maria had already made up her mind. She understood that her medical skills made her invaluable to the squad's survival, but she also knew that her combat training made her capable of contributing to their tactical situation. The old stereotype about medics only patching wounds was about to be shattered forever. "Wilson, trust me on this," she said, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even her. "I know what I'm doing." Before anyone could protest further, Maria opened fire on the nearest enemy position, her rifle cracking steadily as she engaged targets on the mountainside. Her marksmanship training proved effective as enemy fighters were forced to take cover, reducing the volume of fire directed at her squad. "Move! Move! Move!" she called, continuing to engage targets while Wilson, Jenkins, and Davis rushed toward the rocky outcropping. Her covering fire was accurate and sustained, demonstrating that her combat skills were every bit as developed as her medical abilities. The enemy fighters quickly realized that one of the soldiers was providing exceptionally effective covering fire, and they began concentrating their efforts on Maria's position. Bullets struck the ground around her as she continued firing, forcing her to constantly change positions to avoid being targeted. When her squad mates reached the rocks and established their own firing positions, Maria immediately began her own movement toward their location. The 100-meter dash across open ground while under enemy fire was the longest run of her life, but her physical conditioning and tactical training carried her safely to the new position. "Damn, Rodriguez," Jenkins exclaimed as she dove behind the rocks. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Same place you did," she replied, reloading her rifle and preparing to continue the engagement. Infantry training doesn't discriminate based on your job specialty. From their new position, the squad had much better fields of fire and protection from enemy bullets. Maria could see several enemy positions that had been invisible from their previous location, and she began engaging targets with precision fire. Her medical training had taught her anatomy and physiology, knowledge that proved unexpectedly useful when engaging human targets. The Apache helicopter continued its devastating attacks on enemy positions, working in coordination with Maria's squad to eliminate threats systematically. The pilot's voice came through their radio again. "Alpha 2, we're seeing multiple enemy fighters attempting to withdraw from your area. Recommend you maintain your position while we continue to engage." But Maria could see something that the helicopter crew couldn't detect from their altitude. Enemy fighters were using a concealed route through a ravine to position themselves for a flanking attack on their defensive position. If successful, this maneuver would allow the attackers to engage the squad from close range where their superior numbers would be decisive. "Wilson, we have movement in the ravine to our south," she reported, pointing toward the concealed approach route. "Looks like they're trying to flank us." Wilson grabbed his binoculars and confirmed Maria's observation. At least 6 enemy fighters were moving through the ravine, carrying automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. If they reached the far end of the ravine, they would have a clear shot at the squad's position from less than 50 meters away. "Guardian Angel, this is Alpha 2, Jenkins called into his radio. "We have multiple enemy fighters moving through a ravine at grid reference 4256312. They're attempting to flank our position from the south." "Copy, Alpha 2. We see the ravine but cannot engage targets inside it safely. You're going to have to handle this one yourselves." Maria felt her heart rate increase as she realized that her squad would have to engage 6 enemy fighters at close range with only 4 soldiers. The odds were not in their favor, but her medical training had taught her that sometimes survival required taking aggressive action rather than waiting for conditions to improve. "I have an idea," she announced, studying the terrain around the ravine. "If I can get to that ridge overlooking their route, I can engage them before they reach our position." Wilson immediately shook his head. "Too dangerous. That position is completely exposed and you'd be outnumbered 6-1. But Maria could see that the ridge position would give her a significant tactical advantage. The enemy fighters would be trapped in the ravine with limited cover, while she would have excellent fields of fire from an elevated position. It was exactly the type of aggressive medical intervention she had been trained to make. High risk but potentially life-saving. "Sometimes the only way to save lives is to take risks," she said, checking her ammunition and preparing to move. "Cover me!" The enemy fire intensified as the helicopters approached, forcing Maria to work in increasingly dangerous conditions. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions on the rocky slopes above them, indicating that this was a well-planned ambush with multiple fighters. The attackers knew that medical evacuation helicopters represented a high-value target, and they were determined to prevent the rescue. "Rodriguez," Wilson's voice carried across the chaos as he reloaded his rifle. "The enemy is trying to flank our position. We can't hold them much longer." Maria looked up from treating Brown's injuries to see enemy fighters moving along a ridgeline that would give them a clear shot at both vehicles. Her medical bag contained everything needed to treat the wounded, but she also carried a rifle and had received the same combat training as every other soldier in the squad. "Sir, I need to stabilize your men before I can move them," she called to Thompson, her voice strained as she worked to control Brown's bleeding. "But if those fighters reach that ridge, we're all dead." Thompson, despite his head injury, understood the tactical situation. The enemy was using a classic pincer movement, attacking from multiple directions to overwhelm their small force. Standard military doctrine called for immediate withdrawal in such situations, but they couldn't abandon the wounded soldiers. The distinctive sound of an Apache attack helicopter filled the air as close air support finally arrived on scene. Maria could see the heavily armed aircraft circling above the mountain pass, its crew searching for targets among the rocky terrain. The enemy fighters immediately began taking cover, knowing that the helicopter's weapons could devastate their positions. Alpha 2, this is Guardian Angel. A pilot's voice crackled through Jenkins' radio. We have eyes on multiple enemy positions. Be advised, some targets are very close to your location. We need precise coordinates to engage safely. Jenkins grabbed his binoculars and began identifying enemy positions for the attack helicopter. Guardian Angel, I have eyes on 3 fighters at grid reference 456289, approximately 200 meters north of our position. Maria continued working on the casualties while listening to the coordination between her squad and the air support. Brown's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he needed immediate surgical attention that could only be provided at a proper medical facility. Martinez was still trapped but conscious, and she had managed to treat Thompson's head wound. The Apache helicopter's cannon thundered across the mountain pass as it engaged the enemy positions, sending massive explosions echoing through the valleys. Maria could feel the concussion from the aircraft's weapons, but the covering fire allowed Wilson and Jenkins to advance their position and establish better fields of fire. Medevac inbound. 30 seconds. Davis called from their vehicle, monitoring the medical evacuation helicopter's approach. Landing zone needs to be secured. This was the most critical moment of the entire engagement. The medical helicopter would be extremely vulnerable while landing and loading casualties, requiring Maria's squad to provide complete security for the landing zone. But they were still outnumbered and facing enemy fighters in strong defensive positions. Wilson, take Jenkins and secure the north side of the LZ, Thompson ordered, his leadership training overriding the pain from his injuries. Rodriguez, can these men be moved? Maria quickly assessed each casualty one final time. Brown was stable enough for transport, but moving him incorrectly could worsen his internal injuries. Martinez could walk with assistance once they freed him from the debris. Thompson could move on his own despite his head wound. Yes, sir, but we need to be very careful with Brown, she replied. I suspect internal bleeding that could become critical if we move him wrong. The UH-60 medical helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, its crew chief already preparing the cabin to receive casualties. The aircraft approached fast and low, using the terrain to mask its approach from any remaining enemy fighters. Maria could see the door gunners scanning the surrounding area with their weapons ready. As the helicopter touched down, Maria felt a surge of relief mixed with new urgency. They had successfully called for help, but now came the dangerous process of moving wounded soldiers across open ground while under potential enemy fire. The Apache helicopter continued to patrol overhead, but enemy fighters could still be hiding in positions that hadn't been detected. Let's move, Wilson shouted as he and Jenkins began providing security for the evacuation. Rodriguez, you take point with the casualties. Maria helped Thompson to his feet, noting that his balance was still affected by the head injury. Sir, lean on me if you need to. We're going to move fast but steady toward the helicopter. Together, they freed Martinez from the debris that had trapped him, discovering that he had sustained a broken arm and multiple lacerations but could walk with assistance. Brown remained the most seriously injured, requiring careful handling to prevent additional trauma during the evacuation. The medical helicopter's crew chief and medic rushed forward to assist with loading the casualties, their movements quick and professional. Maria briefed them on each patient's condition as they worked, providing crucial information that would help guide treatment during the flight to the field hospital. Brown has suspected internal bleeding. Possible ruptured spleen, she reported quickly. 2 units of saline administered, bleeding controlled externally. Thompson has a concussion with a scalp laceration, alert and oriented. Martinez has a fractured left radius and multiple lacerations, stable vital signs. The helicopter crew nodded, immediately understanding the priority of casualties and how to arrange them in the aircraft. Their efficiency impressed Maria, demonstrating the level of coordination that existed throughout the medical evacuation system. As they loaded the wounded soldiers, enemy fire suddenly erupted from a new position that had been previously undetected. Bullets struck the ground around the helicopter, forcing everyone to take cover while the door gunners returned fire. The Apache helicopter immediately moved to engage the new threat, its cannon sending devastating rounds into the rocky outcropping where the enemy fighters were hiding. "We need to go now," the helicopter pilot called over the aircraft's intercom system. "I'm not comfortable staying on the ground much longer." Maria made a split-second decision that would define her understanding of what it meant to be a combat medic. Instead of boarding the helicopter with the casualties, she grabbed her rifle and moved to support Wilson and Jenkins as they maintained security for the landing zone. "Rodriguez, get on that bird," Thompson called from inside the helicopter. "You've done your job." But Maria understood that her job wasn't finished until every member of her squad was safe. The medical helicopter could take care of the wounded soldiers now, but Wilson, Jenkins, and Davis still needed to be evacuated from the ambush site. Her place was with them, providing both medical support and additional firepower as they fought to survive. The helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo of wounded soldiers, climbing rapidly to avoid enemy fire as it departed for the field hospital. Maria watched it disappear over the mountain ridge, knowing that she had successfully saved 3 lives but also understanding that the fight was far from over. The explosion shattered the morning silence like thunder, sending a massive cloud of dirt and debris into the air. Maria felt the shockwave hit their vehicle before she heard the sound, the force throwing her against the side wall as their driver fought to maintain control. The lead vehicle had disappeared in a cloud of smoke and dust, victim of an improvised explosive device that had been carefully placed in the road. IED. IED. Wilson's voice cut through the chaos as he grabbed his rifle and prepared to exit the vehicle. "Alpha 1 is down. All stations, we are under attack." Maria's training kicked in immediately, her medical instincts overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze her. Through the thick dust cloud, she could see the twisted wreckage of the lead vehicle, smoke pouring from its damaged hull. 4 of her fellow soldiers were inside that vehicle, and her mind automatically began calculating the types of injuries they might have sustained from the blast. The distinctive crack of rifle fire began echoing through the mountain pass as enemy fighters opened fire from concealed positions on the rocky slopes above them. Bullets struck the road around their vehicle, sending sparks flying as they ricocheted off the armor plating. Maria could hear the high-pitched whine of rounds passing close to their position. "We need to get to Alpha 1. Maria shouted over the gunfire, grabbing her medical bag and preparing to leave the relative safety of their vehicle. "Those men need medical attention now." "Negative," Wilson replied, his voice strained as he returned fire toward the enemy positions. "It's too hot out there. We need to suppress the enemy fire before anyone can move." But Maria could see movement in the wreckage of the lead vehicle, signs that at least some of the crew had survived the initial blast. Her medical training had taught her that the first few minutes after a traumatic injury were often the most critical. Every second they waited could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded soldiers. Jenkins was frantically working his radio, trying to establish contact with their base and call for reinforcements. "Base, this is Alpha 2. We are taking heavy fire at Checkpoint Bravo. Alpha 1 is down. Need immediate medical evacuation and close air support." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. "Alpha 2, this is Base. Understand you are under attack. Medical evacuation is being prepared. Estimated arrival 30 minutes. Can you hold your position?" 30 minutes felt like an eternity to Maria as she watched the damaged vehicle continue to smoke. She could see Lieutenant Thompson moving inside the wreckage, but he appeared to be injured and disoriented. The other 3 soldiers in the vehicle were not visible, which could mean they were either unconscious or trapped beneath debris. "I'm going out there," Maria announced, checking her rifle and slinging her medical bag across her shoulder. "Those men won't survive 30 minutes without medical attention." "Rodriguez, that's suicide," Davis protested, his young face pale with fear. "The enemy has clear sight lines on that position. You'll be killed before you make it halfway there." Maria looked at Davis, then at Wilson and Jenkins, seeing the fear in their eyes but also understanding their concern for her safety. These men had become like family to her over the past months, and she knew they were trying to protect her. But her oath as a medic was clear. She was responsible for providing medical care to wounded soldiers, regardless of the personal risk involved. "Listen to me," she said firmly, her voice carrying authority that surprised even her. "I didn't spend 4 years training to be a combat medic just to hide in a vehicle while soldiers die 50 meters away. That's not who I am, and that's not what I swore to do." Wilson studied her face for a moment, recognizing the determination in her eyes. He had served with enough medics to know that the good ones possessed a special kind of courage, one that compelled them to risk their own lives to save others. All right, Rodriguez. But we do this smart. Jenkins and I will provide covering fire while you move to Alpha 1. Davis, you stay here and maintain radio contact. The plan was simple but dangerous. Maria would have to cross 50 meters of open ground while under enemy fire, reach the damaged vehicle, assess the casualties, and provide emergency medical treatment. Meanwhile, Wilson and Jenkins would try to suppress the enemy fighters long enough for her to work. On my mark, Wilson said, positioning himself to provide the best angle of covering fire. 3, 2, 1, go. Maria burst from their vehicle and immediately felt the intensity of enemy fire focused on her position. Bullets whined past her head as she zigzagged across the open ground, using every piece of cover she could find. Her medical bag bounced against her back as she ran, the weight familiar and reassuring. The distance to the lead vehicle seemed to stretch forever, but Maria's training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. She had practiced moving under fire countless times, learning to control her fear and focus on her objective. Behind her, Wilson and Jenkins were firing steadily at the enemy positions, their bullets forcing the attackers to take cover. When she finally reached the damaged vehicle, Maria could see the full extent of the destruction. The IED had torn through the front section, twisting the metal and shattering the bulletproof glass. Lieutenant Thompson was conscious but bleeding from a head wound, while the driver appeared to be unconscious and trapped in his seat. "Thank God you're here." "Rodriguez," Thompson gasped, his voice weak but relieved. "Sergeant Martinez is trapped under debris, and I think Corporal Brown is seriously injured." Maria quickly assessed the situation, her medical training allowing her to prioritize the casualties based on the severity of their injuries. Martinez was trapped but conscious, indicating that his injuries might not be immediately life-threatening. Brown was unconscious and bleeding heavily, making him the priority for immediate treatment. Working under fire required a different kind of medical care than what Maria had practiced in training. She had to balance the need for thorough treatment with the reality that enemy bullets were constantly striking the vehicle around her. Every few seconds she had to duck as rounds sparked off the armor plating just inches from her head. "Sir, I need you to apply pressure to this bandage on your head," she instructed Thompson while working on Brown's more serious injuries. "Can you do that for me?" Thompson nodded, grateful to have something to focus on besides the pain and chaos around them. Maria's calm professionalism in the middle of the firefight gave him confidence that they might actually survive this ambush. As she worked to stop Brown's bleeding and stabilize his condition, Maria could hear the steady crack of Wilson and Jenkins' rifles as they continued to engage the enemy. Their covering fire was keeping the attackers from advancing, but she knew they couldn't hold this position indefinitely. The sound of approaching helicopters filled the air, growing louder as their medical evacuation support finally arrived. But Maria knew that the helicopters couldn't land while the area was still under enemy fire. She would have to continue providing medical care, while her squad fought to secure the landing zone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her medical bag for the third time. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking each compartment to ensure every bandage, morphine syringe, and piece of equipment was exactly where it should be. At 26, she had been a combat medic for 4 years, but today felt different somehow. "Rodriguez, you ready for another peaceful patrol?" called out Corporal Jenkins, the squad's radio operator, as he approached her position near the convoy vehicles. His tone carried the casual confidence of someone who had never seen real combat, despite being deployed for 6 months. Maria looked up from her medical kit, her dark eyes reflecting years of training and dedication. "There's no such thing as a peaceful patrol in this region," she replied quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the unpredictable nature of their environment. "Every step outside these walls could be our last." The other soldiers in Alpha Squad had grown accustomed to Maria's serious approach to their missions. While they joked and laughed to ease the tension, she remained focused on her primary responsibility, keeping them alive when everything went wrong. Her medical training had taught her to see the human body as a complex system that could fail in countless ways, and her combat experience had shown her how quickly those failures could occur. Lieutenant Thompson, their squad leader, gathered the 8-person team around a dusty map spread across the hood of their lead vehicle. His finger traced a route through the mountainous terrain that surrounded their forward operating base. Intelligence reports indicate minimal enemy activity along this route, he explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone fresh from officer training. We're conducting a routine patrol to check on the village of Kandahar Ridge and assess the local population's needs. Maria studied the map carefully, noting the narrow mountain passes and limited escape routes. Her medical training had taught her to anticipate problems before they occurred, and something about this mission made her uneasy. The terrain offered too many perfect positions for an ambush, and recent intelligence reports had been inconsistent about enemy movements in the area. "Sir, what's our extraction plan if we encounter resistance?" she asked, her finger pointing to a particularly narrow section of the mountain road. "This choke point here could trap us if we're not careful." Lieutenant Thompson glanced at the map, then back at Maria with a slight smile. "Rodriguez, you're a medic, not a tactical officer. Your job is to patch us up if someone gets a scrape, not to worry about combat operations. Leave the fighting to the real soldiers." The comment stung, but Maria had heard variations of it throughout her career. Despite her extensive combat training, many of her fellow soldiers still saw her primarily as a support role, someone who stayed back while the real warriors engaged the enemy. They didn't understand that her medical knowledge made her acutely aware of just how fragile life could be in combat situations. Specialist Davis, the squad's youngest member at 19, looked nervous as he checked his rifle for the 4th time. Maria noticed his hands shaking slightly as he loaded his magazines, and she made a mental note to keep an eye on him during the patrol. Young soldiers often tried to hide their fear, but Maria's trained eye could spot the signs of pre-mission anxiety. "Davis, take a deep breath," she said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "Remember your training, trust your equipment, and stay close to the squad. We'll all look out for each other out there." The young soldier nodded gratefully, his respect for Maria evident in his eyes. Unlike some of the others, he had seen her work during training exercises and understood that her medical expertise came with a deep understanding of combat tactics and survival techniques. As the squad performed final equipment checks, Maria reviewed the medical supplies she carried. Her aid bag contained enough materials to treat multiple casualties, from simple bandages to emergency surgical equipment. She had trained extensively in combat medicine, learning to perform life-saving procedures under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The convoy consisted of 2 armored vehicles, each carrying 4 soldiers. Maria rode in the second vehicle with Davis, Jenkins, and Sergeant Wilson, a veteran soldier who had served 3 previous deployments. Wilson had always treated Maria with respect, understanding that her role required both medical expertise and combat readiness. "You know, Rodriguez," Wilson said as they climbed into their vehicle, "I've seen plenty of medics come and go over the years. Most of them are good at the medical stuff but fall apart when the shooting starts. You're different, though. You've got that look in your eyes that says you're ready for whatever comes." Maria appreciated Wilson's confidence, but she knew that preparation and reality were 2 different things. Her training had included extensive combat scenarios, but she had never been tested in actual combat. Today's patrol would take them through some of the most dangerous terrain in their area of operations, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their luck was about to run out. As the convoy pulled away from the base, Maria watched the familiar sights of their compound disappear behind them. The guard towers, razor wire, and concrete barriers that provided security suddenly seemed very far away. Ahead lay 15 miles of mountain roads, narrow passes, and uncertain terrain where enemy fighters could be waiting. The first few miles passed without incident, the vehicles navigating carefully along roads that had been carved into the mountainside decades earlier. Maria kept her medical bag within easy reach and maintained constant communication with the lead vehicle through their radio system. "All stations, this is Alpha 1, Lieutenant Thompson's voice crackled through the radio. "We're approaching checkpoint Bravo. Maintain security and stay alert." Maria felt her heart rate increase slightly as they entered the most dangerous section of their route. The narrow mountain pass ahead offered limited visibility and multiple positions where enemy fighters could launch an attack. Her medical training had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling her that something was wrong. The mountain road stretched ahead like a concrete ribbon, winding through terrain that had witnessed countless conflicts over the centuries. Maria checked her watch and calculated that they were exactly where the enemy would expect them to be, following a predictable route at a predictable time. In just a few minutes, her understanding of what it meant to be a combat medic would change forever.